We only use two shooting modes for time-lapse photography. That's aperture priority and manual mode. And most of the time you're just going to be using aperture priority mode. If the lighting isn't going to change at all, then you can use manual mode. But the chances are, if you're shooting over a long period of time, you're going to want to use aperture priority mode, because minor changes to the exposure in manual mode will show up significantly when it comes to time-lapse photography. So you can use manual mode, but most of the time I would recommend using aperture priority mode for the best results. How do you set your aperture for time-lapse photography? Well, if you think you're going to set the aperture the same way you would for landscape photography, you're out of luck. It doesn't work like that. And the reason for that is because of how the aperture functions. So every time you go to take a photo, the aperture narrows itself and takes a photo. So let's say I set the camera and the lens to take a photo f8. Every time I go to take a photo, that aperture is closing and then opening again. And the problem with that is that that process is not consistent. It's very close between each frame, but there's going to be minor differences between each frame. And that causes something called flicker. And flicker is this thing that you see in old black and white films and poorly made time-lapse movies, where you can kind of just see the frame going like this. And you want to avoid that. The best way to avoid that is to set your aperture all the way open. So if you have an f2.8 lens, set your aperture to f2.8. 3.5, set it to 3.5. The shutter speed you use for time-lapse photography is totally different to what you'd actually use for landscape photography. The reason being, you actually want some motion blur in your frames. So anything that is perfectly still, like a building or a bridge or something like that, needs to be sharp. And at 1/50th of a second, it will be sharp. However, anything that's moving, such as a person walking through a crowd or a car driving over a bridge, you need to have a little bit of blur in that. You don't want that to be tack sharp, because otherwise you start to get flicker and it just looks a bit sticky and disjointed. You can get a much smoother and more professional film look to your time-lapse movies if you have a slower shutter speed. So 1/50th of a second is a really good place to start. You can go to 1/10th of a second, 1/4 of a second, and so on. You want to have some motion blur whenever there's something moving in your frame. The secret to scene selection with time-lapse photography is to always look for movement. I could take a time-lapse of me sitting down in my office, but there's just really very little movement there. That's quite a boring time-lapse. What you want to look for is movement. Now, movement can be anywhere. It can be the clouds moving across the sky, people walking through a park, cars driving over a bridge, whatever it is, you need to look for movement. And if there isn't movement in the frame, you can actually add movement to your camera. You can put it on a motorized slider that will go back and forth, or a panning head that will go from side to side. Whatever you do, you need to make sure you include movement in your frame. So always look for a scene that is going to have plenty of mesmerizing movement. Before you set up your time-lapse, you need to consider the number of frames you're going to shoot. And that depends on the length of the final footage you want to capture. So in Europe, every second of final footage requires 30 photos. In America, it's 24. So if you want 10 seconds of final footage, you need to capture 300 photos. And depending on the interval, this might take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours. In America, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you only need 240 images. Now, why 30 frames per second versus 24? Well, there's arguments for and both. I will personally say that I think that the European 30 frames per second looks more professional, more film-like, and I prefer it. But I think most people won't notice a difference. But you need to bear in mind, how many frames do I want to capture? For how long do I want the video to be? If I want it to be 5 seconds and I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, then I need 150 photos captured. Once you've decided on your aperture, shutter speed, and how many photos you want to shoot, you need to set up your intervalometer. Your intervalometer is the little tool that you plug into your camera. You can set the number of frames you want it to capture and how long the interval should be, and then you just hit start. It is the only essential bit of kit that you need for time-lapse photography. You can add panning heads and sliders and tilting, and you can even add filters for the end of your lens. That all will help to create more interesting time-lapses, but the only thing you actually need is an intervalometer. One of the most important factors to consider for time-lapse photography is the interval that you set. That is, how long between each frame. Now this can range anywhere from 1 second to 30 seconds to hours if you really want it to, but I find that the best results come from anywhere from 2 seconds to 30 seconds, and it all comes down to what you're shooting. So let's say I'm taking photos of people walking very normal paces through a park. I would probably want a 2-second interval, because every 2 seconds they're going to be a couple steps further away and there'll be a little bit of motion blur, and that will look very smooth. If I set it to 10 seconds, people are just going to be popping up all over the place. And that's not what you want. You want to see some movement. You want to be able to track the movement across the frame. On the other hand, if I'm shooting the Milky Way takes a 30-second exposure. That's how long it's going to take to capture it. So I can't set the interval at anything less than 30 seconds, so I set it to 30 seconds. And let's talk about something in between. Maybe there's some cars moving very slowly in traffic, and they're just going to go they're just doing this very small movement through traffic. You might want to set it to 5 or 10-second intervals. It all depends on the speed of what's moving in your frame. The faster it moves, the shorter the interval. The slower it moves, the longer the interval, which is why the Milky Way has a 30-second interval and a person walking through a park has a 2-second interval. Thanks for watching the 7 steps to professional time-lapse photography. While I have you here, I've just released a brand new course on time-lapse photography, and you can find out all of the details below. So go ahead and take a look. Thanks for watching.